A question then becomes, well, what of the global South? What are we to make of the global South within a kind of thrust within urban theory which tends to want to efface these kinds of differences, all kinds of differences, north-south, particularly at the point where it's just been in recent years where the South has been in some ways recuperated as a kind of resource in terms of trying to address the parochialism of urban theory and its biases in terms of what kinds of urban conditions, what kinds of cities it pays attention to. So in part, the notion of detachment comes from a series of particular questions. That is, can we sustain a conceptual detachment of something called the urban South without having really any basis for doing so, except perhaps as a locus through which we might better understand the importance of processes of detachment in cities everywhere? That is a kind of conceptual detachment called the urban South without any basis for doing so as a way to understand a kind of process of detachment generally. So even when commonly used as a point of reference, the prevailing assumption was that the South's difference was produced through relations in colonial, imperial, global economic, and other geopolitical infrastructures that engendered both dependency and marginalization. Yet can we make an arbitrary, yet politically driven move to detach a South from the structures of those relations so that we might find ways of keeping particular processes and instances of urbanization, at least in some places, away from an intensified capitalization of space, bodies, and collective experience? That is, without any basis in doing so, can we arbitrarily make a kind of distinction of the South as a kind of prosthetic, as this word was used often in the workshop today, as a way to keep something detached, removed from this kind of onslaught of neoliberal capital remaking of urban space? Can we be indifferent to the absence of analytical verification in a move that enfolds intensely divergent urban situations in a well-worn, highly treaded conceptualization that seeks not to deploy the South as negation or a source of redemption or a distinct ontological condition? The intent is rather to use the urban South as a locus to detach ourselves from an analytics that prioritizes relationality and instead amplify the fragility of relations and how urban residents deal with that fragility in a productive way. So that's in some sense the question of the notion of detachment. So that we detach ourselves from a kind of preoccupation with prioritizes relationality and instead amplify the fragility of relations and how urban residents deal with that fragility in a potentially productive way. So here the urban South becomes an anything whatsoever. An anything whatsoever detached from having a specific geopolitical history or location. In other words, since the point of referring to an urban South was once to highlight the ways the majority of the world's urban population were detached already from mainstream urban theorization and now have been substantially included within an urban analytics that no longer needs the South as a point of reference, that is, i.e. global neoliberalism, what if we stayed with this detachment? What if we simply just stayed with it without any grounds for doing so? What if we stayed with it knowing full well that an urban South does not really exist as a means of thinking through the various instances and powers of detachment as they affect urban residents today?